Hello watch enthusiasts and welcome to this week's episode of Watch Chronicler podcast, now available on iTunes, Spotify, SoundCloud or any podcast app which you might have where you'll be able to find Watch Chronicler. Now today I'd like to speak about watch bracelets, because watch bracelets are something which we've all worn at some point, whether it's because you chose to buy the watch bracelet with a timepiece because it was a more cost-effective option, or because you found it to be a more attractive way of wearing the watch. You will most likely have come across one, and most people have worn one on a regular basis at some point in their life. But the truth is that we've come across a lot of different standards of quality. Whether you look at a Seiko 5 or something from Patek Philippe, you're going to see a very different level of quality, inevitably. And much has been made of this in terms of features like, for example, the nature of the individual links within the bracelet, the finishing, the way the clasp is assembled. But rarely is it considered what actually makes a good watch bracelet. Because a good watch bracelet doesn't necessarily have to be one with the most expensive specifications. The truth is that watch bracelets are more complex than that in terms of what makes a good bracelet, so I'll be considering that in today's episode, as well as considering what the best watch bracelets are out there, with a few choices which I've come across, which I've found to be the best quality. So there's all that to look forward to in today's episode. And this week's episode is sponsored by Oris, the maker of unique watches for those who relish detail and innovation at a sensible price. More on that later. Before I begin, if you're listening to and watching this podcast on YouTube, then like, share and subscribe, and if you're listening to it elsewhere, follow us there as well. It really helps the channel, and also gives us an idea of what you're interested in so we can produce more interesting content in the future. Also head over to our Instagram page, which is Watch Chronicler, to be able to see new content, previews of pieces, and also fantastic photography to really get involved with Watch Chronicler too. Also, head over to watchchronicler.com, which is the hub of Watch Chronicler content, with articles, podcasts, and features which you wouldn't see elsewhere appearing there on a very regular basis. To give you an idea of the format of this podcast, I'd like to speak about the different parts of a bracelet and the pros and cons to each function or build, bearing in mind the fact that different constructions give different effects which aren't necessarily better or worse. So the first thing to speak about really is the bracelet construction. And in terms of what you see on the market, you see riveted links, folded links and solid links. Now, folded links are in many ways the most basic form. They are just sheets of metal which have been bent over into individual links which make up a bracelet. The problem with these is that because they are just folded around, they tend to stretch over time, they tend to wear, and they tend to become very loose over several years of wear. So these, if you look at older watches from say, even the 90s, for example, you'll find that a lot of these bracelets are quite loose and stretch out quite significantly because of the fact they're not solid in construction. Then another form of this is the riveted link. Riveted links are seen very often on, well, most commonly Rolexes, from the mid-20th century through the 50s, 60s, and some into the 70s too, you occasionally see. And these are links which are partially hollow and then have been riveted together through a bar being put through each end of the individual link, and then riveted in the sense the end has been punched flat, holding the bracelet together and holding sides on the bracelet too, which are separate pieces which slot on. This is generally pretty antiquated, and if you see a riveted bracelet on a modern watch, then it's most likely going to be an imitation of those original bracelets on something like a Tudor Black Bay. And these are actually solid links. And solid links are in many ways the most common links you see on most reasonable quality watches. Now, of course, you see folded or hollow links on watches like a Seiko SKX, where people actually have grown to like the looseness of the bracelet, but objectively speaking, they aren't very good quality bracelets and don't last terribly well. Solid links, on the other hand, are, just as the name would suggest, solid metal, whether that's steel, titanium, gold, whatever it might be. So the only holes in it are the slots specifically designed to take whatever means holds each link together, whether it's a screwed bar, a split pin or something like that, which I'll come on to later. Because the beauty of this kind of setup is, firstly, that they don't deform over time. They'll remain exactly the same shape. Okay, there will be some minute wear to the areas where the bracelet will pivot, but this is very standard wear and tear and would take an inordinately long time to actually become a problem. So realistically, you're not going to find any trouble with that over time. However, something to consider is the means with which these links are held together. Now, where it's fairly easy to agree that solid links are almost always better objectively than riveted or folded links because they don't wear over time, they are a much more resilient stand, and also they allow for very good finishing too, and fantastic consistency of link shape, which is exactly what you want. Even if you might like a slightly looser bracelet, this can be achieved with solid links, as has been seen with some modern Jubilee bracelets. But the means with which bracelets are held together is with a variety of different pin arrangements. Now, the most basic thing you'll come across is the split pin. Now, a split pin looks a bit like a sort of hairpin with two sections protruding from a single end. So the idea is that with an appearance which is quite similar to a flat screw with a single slot in it, these are pushed in one particular direction through the links of a bracelet, and these two hairpin ends spread apart and through friction prevent the pin from falling out again. And then if you want to remove them, you just punch them out of the other side with either a small handheld punch or a particular tool with a vise, which you can also use if you're a proper watchmaker. Now, this isn't actually the oldest solution, though this is largely seen as being the cheapest solution. This isn't actually the oldest solution. On old bracelets with riveted links, you couldn't actually adjust the links themselves, so the clasp itself would have to accommodate the bracelet movement through different slots where you'd move the spring bar along to lengthen or shorten the bracelet depending upon your wrist size. However, the next thing up from a split pin, which is what you might find in say, a Seiko SKX as a previously used example, is the pin and collar. This is a slightly more evolved solution, if you will, to the pin which is pushed through the bracelet. These feature rounded rolls of metal, you could say, cylindrical rolls of metal, which would be collars which slot into the bracelet, and these engage with a pin which this time isn't split, it's a solid piece which is slotted through, and through friction this again holds everything in place. Now, these have been seen for many years on watches as illustrious as a Patek Philippe Nautilus, and many people have had quite a lot to say about this because they are in many ways antiquated in the sense that if you lose a collar, for example, you have to go to an awful lot of trouble to source a new one because you can't reconnect the bracelet without it, which, as you can imagine, is a frustration. However, the beauty of these is that they don't wear out over time in the same way as you see screws, for example, which is the next thing I'll be speaking about, because the screw is something which, if mistreated, will be destroyed, whereas a pin and collar is a very robust and a very resilient solution. So the next thing along is the screwed link. Now, most screwed links are single-sided, so the bar which goes between two links, which holds them together, slots in through a hole in one side and then screws into threading in the other side of the link. So the screw and the bracelet have to match each other, so you have to have very specific screws. And these are much easier to resize than any kind of pin arrangement, and on the whole will be perfectly satisfactory. Of course, there are some situations where a manufacturer glues the screws. This is surprisingly common, where a manufacturer glues the screws in place so as to stop them from falling out before resizing. Now, they won't fall out if you screw them tightly anyway, but I've seen quite a lot of cases where screws have been destroyed because a brand has glued the screws in place and someone's tried to rotate them and has ended up burring the screw quite badly. So this is something to bear in mind, but again, it does all come down to quality. A high-quality pin and collar system I would take, frankly, over a cheap screwed link, because if the screws aren't machined very well, if there are rough edges, then the whole bracelet will be very difficult to size, and you do have situations on sub-£1,000 watches where you can't actually get a link removed at all because of this problem. So, as ever, it's a case of quality in relation to the price point. Now, the most, in my opinion, effective solution is what Omega use, which is the screwed capped link. This is where you have a screw in either side of the link, which unscrews like a lid, like a bottle lid, and in the middle you find a simple cylindrical pin, which acts as a sort of bar which holds together the links. This is extremely effective because there's no rotation being applied to the screws, unlike a normal screwed pin where it itself is screwed but is also being subjected to the rotation of the bracelet. These don't come undone by themselves, no matter how they're machined, But again, it's a precision exercise, so if this can be done to a high standard, then they're fantastic. Now, very often the choice of what is put into a bracelet, whilst I believe that screw cap links are the best balance of durability, functionality, and also beauty in terms of the look of them on the side of a bracelet. Now, in most cases, if you can get a good quality screwed or screw cap link, and you can be sure of the quality, then that's brilliant. Really, it's screwed links under about £300 I tend to find. Often you find irregularities in the build of the bracelet, and sometimes this can pose a problem. But to be quite honest, for the most part, they're a good choice. But now a message from our sponsor. Often regarded as an inaccessible feature offered only by the most prestigious and historic of brands, the tourbillon is a mechanism designed to rotate the escapement of a watch, thus accounting for gravity. Whilst functionally curious, the view of this complication has fascinated watch lovers for years, yet today we see a change of tack for this feature. Orage has conceived a Swiss-made tourbillon available for an entirely unprecedented price of 7,000 francs. Produced with an emphasis on precision, accuracy and quality, these movements are conceived to balance Swiss tradition with absolute modernity at half the price of the nearest contender. Designed to advance this complication, Orage have created a unique aesthetic supported with quality. Having visited Orage's facilities in Biel, Switzerland, I can speak for the quality and the care with which these movements are designed for everyday life. In this way, the Tourbillon 1 from Orage represents the exceptional made accessible. In this way, the Tourbillon 1 from Orage represents the exceptional made accessible and the tourbillon taken from the atelier to the laboratory. Learn more at orage.com. But an important aspect I'd like to touch on in this podcast is the fact that the quality of the bracelet and the enjoyment you get from the bracelet doesn't necessarily hinge upon any of these solutions. The reason why I say that is because a lot of bracelets on dress watches, for example, some Patek Philippe take this approach, but also some Zodiac bracelets and Seiko Marine Master bracelets use pins, because these bracelets are either very fine or were designed that way. And the point is that with some of these watches, the numbers produced, which are generally smaller than people recognise, would mean that there would be a significant markup if they had to redesign all of these things. Now, in the case of the Zodiac, for example, the pins allow them to have a much finer bracelet, rather than much thicker links, which wouldn't have the same feel on the wrist. In the case of the Marine Master, it's much more down to the conservative nature of Seiko, but then again, you're getting an extremely good quality and very good value product already. So I think that if a bracelet still works and you're comfortable with the resizing process, all of these will function correctly, provided they're well made. But now that we've dealt with the way in which the bracelet holds itself together, we have to address the way in which the bracelet attaches itself to the watch. Now, end links are the standard way of attaching a bracelet to a watch, with the exception of something like a mesh bracelet, which connects much like a strap, and is, in my opinion, much less of a faff to put on and take off, which is why I must say I rather like them. But putting that to one side, you also have integrated bracelets, which don't have an end link at all, but they have a case for the watch, which is actually designed to take the bracelet directly. In this case, really, if you like the watch, you have very little choice over the bracelet. So that's something which you choose alongside the watch, and actually makes the other components of this podcast all the more important as to whether you choose to enjoy that watch, because you won't be able to change this one feature which you'll use every day. However, the most traditional means of attaching a bracelet to a watch is the hollow end link. These are folded over and folded into a sort of C shape to follow the line of the lug, and have a hollow centre, as the name would suggest. They're generally stamped to form the outline of the bracelet, so the number of links the bracelet might have and the same finish. And these have a set system almost always, where the spring bar which holds the end link to the case is also the spring bar which holds the bracelet to the end link. So they slot together like that, and so you have to pin them together, so to speak, with the spring bar as you attach them to the watch. And this is something which can be quite fiddly, because these can be bent or deformed whilst you try to attach them to the case, and this can cause a bit of trouble, really. But in most cases, they're no real problem. Solid end links are generally regarded as a better solution. These are a solid chunk of metal. They are machined, well, they have to be machined with a great deal of care to fit between the lugs extremely well and very snugly. So these can't be manipulated so as to fit better. They are the way they are. So if you have a watch, and this is something which again occurs in more affordable watches with solid end links, in say the sub £400 sort of price range, if one is badly machined, I've seen watches where once the bracelet has been removed for the first time, it's been impossible, even with the care of a watchmaker, to put the bracelet back on. So this is something to bear in mind, that it's again the quality which matters. However, if you get a really good quality solid end link, you'll be paid dividends in the long term in terms of enjoyment, just because it won't deform over time. It will generally be much more robust, and also they can imitate the appearance of the bracelet much better because they can have a 3D form, not just be stamped to look like the bracelet. Now these also give you one further option, which is seen on a number of bracelets and usually is seen on more premium bracelets, and this is a really excellent feature. This is an independent end link, so that's to say that it's attached to the bracelet not via a spring bar, but via a split pin, a screw, or any of those other link connecting processes. This means that you don't have to hold the end link to the bracelet whilst you attach it, because the spring bar which passes through the end link is separate from any one which is going to pivot. Now the result of this is actually a bracelet which is potentially stronger, and you see this on something like a Rolex Submariner. A modern day Rolex Submariner will have this, as well as Omega Seamasters and really most premium watches of that style. And the result is a more robust bracelet and a setup which is easier to fit and to remove. Now different end links have different quirks. For example, some Seiko end links don't have slots to put a tool into, so you have to use the drilled lugs of the watch to push the bracelet off. This does result invariably in scratches on the back of the watch, and isn't the most elegant approach. But depending upon the bracelet, and usually this will be easier with an independent solid end link, you should be able to change the strap very easily. It's only when something's poorly machined that you're going to have trouble. Clasps are perhaps the biggest area of contention about what the best kind of bracelet is. And the general styles you get, generally there are two styles you'll find for the way in which they deploy. Because of course you can also call them deployants, and they are deployant clasps, technically speaking, because of what they do. They open like that. And there are generally two of those varieties. There are butterfly clasps and elbow joints. Butterfly clasps are a more dressy solution with two smaller joints which open. This tends to lead to much thinner clasps, but doesn't give you the option for as much complication within them. So it's a choice there. But these tend to work on integrated bracelet dress watches. The elbow joint is something used much more on sports bracelets, but actually is a more common setup anyway, where there is just a single elbow joint which opens up to allow you to remove the watch and put it on. And the beauty of both of these is that should the clasp come undone whilst you're wearing it, simply going about your daily business, it will simply hang from your wrist and you can put it on. You'll feel the clunk as well. So there's no real worry about that. There are also separate bracelets, and these are rarely seen these days, to be honest, because for most people they're just not as practical a solution as butterfly or elbow joint setups. You see them a lot on divers' watches from the 60s and 70s, where it was like a sort of seatbelt approach, so you'd slot two pieces together, which would click together and form a bracelet, but could come undone. So this is something very different, because you don't see them very often, with only brands like, for example, Helsum producing some for their dive watches because they fit with the style. But generally, this is an inferior setup in terms of the actual functionality of the item. Now, one debated aspect within watches and within these bracelets and these clasps is whether you look at stamped or solid deployants. Now, stamped is the traditional sort of style, so a stamping process takes a flat piece of metal and then punches it, so to speak, into the correct shape. And so they would do this with the two halves of the elbow joint or with the top of the clasp itself. Now, if you do it with the top of the clasp, this leaves you with a less aesthetically pleasing, more rounded form, just because of the nature of how you can force metal into a shape. A solid construction, on the other hand, which is cast in that form, will have all the sharp edges, the crisp lines which you want. Now, this is non-essential, of course, but it's something to bear in mind in any case. Where this is more of an impact on the wear of the watch is the deployment itself, on the elbow joint. If you look at a solid elbow joint, this will be thicker but more resilient, so you won't be able to bend it. So if you do perhaps if the clasp comes undone or you lean on it, or you fall over or something like that, you're very, very unlikely to do any damage to the actual function of it. A stamped one, on the other hand, may bend, and it's very difficult to remove the bend from these, although it's very rare to actually manage to do. The advantage, though, to a stamped clasp is the fact that it adds a much thinner profile. A solid clasp will be much thicker. And so this depends upon what you want. There was some discussion about the Oleg and Weiss I reviewed at the weekend, which has a relatively high price and a stamped clasp, but in this case it does give a slimmer profile to the bracelet, so I feel it does fit. So this depends upon your applications. And whilst we revere certain bracelets as being better quality than others, this does depend upon the fit with the watch. I think the gold standard out there is the Rolex Oyster bracelet, because in its most modern form, especially in Sea Dweller setup, where it has both a dive extension as well as a ratcheting expansion, as well as a fantastically solid construction and a brilliant action to the deployant, you get an enormous amount. But again, for a dress watch, something like an AP Royal Oak has a truly gorgeous setup with its bracelet, unlike, it must be said, the Patek Philippe Nautilus, which feels decidedly flimsy, because the parts are very, very well machined, though they are more delicate than you would see on a sports watch. So it does come down to what you're after in particular. And the clasp action varies too, whether you have push buttons on the sides of the clasp, as is seen amongst most Omegas, or you go for a fold-over clasp, as you would see on a Rolex Submariner. This depends upon what you want from the clasp. In truth, I think the only setup which is genuinely problematic is when you have a clasp which is just friction-held, because these over time will wear down, they will wear out, and you will end up with a situation where the clasp is no longer anywhere near as tight as it was when you first had it. But in truth, the other actions out there are all reasonably secure, and it comes down to how well produced they are at the end of the day, the quality of the springs within the clasp, and so on. And of course then you have the addition of dive extensions and adjustments, and this does add an awful lot. If you're the sort of person who likes to change the fit of your strap and your bracelet throughout the day, these will come in as invaluable additions to a bracelet. And then of course there are some people who frankly just need a small micro adjustment on their bracelet to make up for half a link, say, which they might not be able to add or remove from the bracelet to fit better. So I hope this podcast has given you a good overview of the pros and cons of different aspects of bracelets, and also has touched upon what actually makes a good bracelet, because I don't think it's as clear cut as people often put it out to be, as simply being down to whether pieces are solid metal or whether they're stamped or cut or the different forms. It comes down to how they're used within a bracelet. So tell me what you thought in the comments section down below, and remember to like, share and subscribe. Thank you very much for watching or listening, if you're listening to it on any of the forms of media which you can get this podcast. This is Armand from WatchChronicle.com, out.